Hello, everyone, and welcome to Freedom Worldwide, presented by Atlas Network. I'm Tom Palmer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Atlas Network, and today we're visiting with regional experts and Atlas Network partners in the great country of India to discuss the growing freedom movement in the world's most populous democracy. But before I introduce our three guests, for those of you who may be new to Atlas Network, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicating to supporting local idea entrepreneurs who are advancing liberty in their countries and communities. We support a network of 567 independent pro-liberty organizations in 103 different countries, with training, grants, and mentorship with colleagues and networking all around the globe. We don't take any taxpayers' money at all, and we never will. And that means our work, this program, rely on donations from people like you. And if you haven't yet given to Atlas Network, consider joining us with a gift of $25 or more, and we'll send a physical subscription of our magazine Freedom's Champion to your door, delivered by a uniformed agent of the American government. You'll find a link to subscribe in our chat window today. So let me introduce our panelists today. First up, we have Parth Shah. Parth is a real father or grandfather of the liberty movement in India. He's currently the dean at the Indian School of Public Policy and the F.A. Hayek Chair in Spontaneous Order. Our next is Bhuvana Anand. She's the co-founder of Prosperiti, which is a think tank based in India that advances opening up opportunities to the entire population of India. And Amit Chandra, who's the CEO of the Center for Civil Society, which is a remarkably influential group that had been, interestingly, founded by Parth Shah before he went on to his new incarnation. So with that, let me just start by asking Parth, you've been involved in this movement in India so long. You had been a professor of economics in the United States at University of Michigan and returned to India to make a new beginning for the liberty movement. Tell me how that is shaped up in the intervening decades.
Well, it has been, I think, tremendous joy to do what I have been doing since 1997. So when we started Center for Civil Society in 1997, and just to give an example, what was the intellectual climate even at that time, I was invited by one of the top business newspapers editorial team to give a talk about what CCS is, what I'm trying to do in India. And after my brief presentation, the first question I got from the editorial team of a business newspaper was, is CIA funding you? So that's really where it all started, right? And this is how our ideas were seen at the time in India. Despite we already had great liberalization of 1991 quite underway, but the intellectual climate hadn't yet really changed that much. I think from that, we have come a long, long way. Many of my colleagues who were at the CCS now run their own think tanks and organizations around the country. Bhuvana, of course, Prosperiti, she was one of the first group of people working at CCS right after her college graduation. Amit Chandra had worked with me earlier, and now he's the CEO of Center for Civil Society. There are friends in Kerala, CPPR, Danu Raj, who runs a very interesting, very influential think tank in the southern state of Kerala. We have a friend in Jharkhand who runs a think tank there. There's a Northeast Youth Foundation run by Ranjan Barua. So there are a large number of people, small and big in many ways, are sort of taking these ideas to a larger and larger audience, including to policymakers at the state and national level.
Well, one of the things that's really so impressive of what you've achieved, instead of having a kind of monopoly with the group that you founded, you encouraged the proliferation of other groups and initiatives that could reinforce and find things that you weren't doing that they could do better, whether it was regionally. India is a vast, enormous country with a great deal of devolution of powers and state governments and so on. And so there's just been this astonishing flourishing of the liberty movement in India from the seeds that you planted. I'd like to ask, though, about some of the hits and misses of the movement because it's been quite influential. What are some of the highlights? Let me turn to Bhuvana and Amit. Some of the big successes, and then maybe some of the missed opportunities that need to be revisited. So, Bhuvana, let me start with you.
The hits. So I was just before the podcast, we were talking with Parth a little bit. And in 2001 at CCS, we held this conference on education. And we thought that it might be a good start to popularize ideas such as school choice. And at that conference, Parth and our colleagues were booed down. We were called voucherwalas for the longest time. But today, these concepts have been embedded in the mainstream conversation. They're part of the policy menu and not just in education, right? Across in health, in something as simple as cooking gas cylinders, and so on and so forth. So I feel like just the way the ideas have translated into practical policy prescriptions adopted by different governments at the union level as well as the state, to my mind, that's the biggest sort of set of hits, right? And we've counted so many of them, these policy wins over the years. The misses, I would say, well, before that, the second biggest hit is the people hit, the conversion of individuals from one side of thinking about an issue to now viewing the issue in a very, very different way. And that number is, I feel we will really struggle to put a list of people together whose minds we have changed on subjects, right? The misses of the movement, I feel, not so much the movement, but the engaging with democracy. I think that there's a great line. I think it's Gordon Kulock who says politics, democracy is government by discussion, and in some ways, we have still been speaking at a 20,000 foot view level. And to be able to convert that with detail, with government by government on the issue within the constitutional framework, there we've, I think, done only partial success. And there we've got a fair distance to cover. So this is sort of my big summary of how the movement has fared.
Amit, why don't you address one of the more exciting things from an outsider's perspective, which was the legalization of livelihood, allowing so many vendors to become legal businesses with the dignity and the freedom and the security that they could do business in a legal manner and not be driven away by the police or subjected to shakedowns. Tell me about how that campaign started and how successful it's been.
Thank you very much, Tom. In fact, this is what was in my mind when you asked this question, that street vending has been, in my opinion, a big hit. But how this entire campaign started, actually it didn't start with street vending keeping in mind. It started with the key question, the big debate of rich getting richer and poor getting poorer, and why is that happening? And India got its economic reforms in 1991. We say first generation of reforms. It was targeted on a couple of sectors, and those working in reformed sectors started getting benefits of it. However, other areas of life and livelihoods and economy, which didn't see any reform, people were not able to rise in economy. So we started thinking about this informal market and setups and an organized sector and how that can be organized. And we started thinking about it. We thought we need to pick one occupation to demonstrate. And this is how we picked up street vending. And the journey started. Finally, we got a national level legislation to protect the livelihood rights of street vendors. But let me further add a few more things to street vending, because this entire campaign with street vending, we want to demonstrate the nano entrepreneurs that they also have the right to livelihood with dignity. And therefore, when Government of India also started talking about ease of doing business, we ran a similar parallel campaign talking about how this ease of doing business could actually work for poor and marginalized as well. And therefore, the campaign still continues. The other big hit actually, which is I see in the space of school education, we have been talking about DBT vouchers. How do we kind of encourage edupreneurs to participate and bring more quality of education? And one of the fundamental things that we at CCS started talking about, that there requires to be a clear separation of functions in education regulatory space, because the operator is also the regulator. And finally, the for me, happiest moment was when the new national education policy came in 2020. It has this provision which clearly says that now there will be a new independent regulator which will be outside the department. So separating this was like a one big dream coming true. So these are my hits.
I remember at a conference some years ago in India, going to one of the local villages with another participant and finding these independent schools, non-state schools, 11 of them. It was really astonishing. And the pupils all learning the equivalent of what they call in America the ABCs and arithmetic, all the way up to high school level school, all independent, all non-state organized. And it was just really eye-opening experience to see that humble, poor people love their children and they invest from their own modest resources to secure a better life for them. That's been one of the most inspiring things I've seen that you and your colleagues have done in India, is to secure for them the freedom to be able to educate their children and give them that opportunity in life, in future. Now, there's elections coming up. These are going to be the 18th general elections in India. What do you think should be on the agenda of the government following the elections? What would be some of the highlights for you? Let me go back to Parth quickly.
I think there are quite a few areas where government already has done a great start. So one, I think, big area of reforms and also implementation, which has been infrastructure, financial inclusion, right? So having enabling people to open bank accounts, access those bank accounts through online sort of platforms at no cost to them. So I'm able to make financial transactions today with my cell phone, right? Be able to sell and buy anything I want with just a cell phone attached to my bank account. So I think that has been a tremendous and it's an empowering instrument for the poor. So I think in some ways, building on some of these areas where government has started first, looking at how, for example, financial inclusion, the next step in that would be to make it possible for people to access credit. So yes, now I'm able to sort of use my bank account to make transactions at a zero cost, but at the same time, still I don't have a street vendor would not be able to get a credit from a formal institution. He or she still needs to go to an informal money lender to access their loan. So I think some of those things can be expanded quite well and building on what they already have done. Other area I think government has done quite a good job is subsidies reform and building on that further. So DBT, what has happened in education in terms of giving money to the parents to buy their own, in a sense, cylinder, gas cylinder, other daily consumable items. So expanding that kind of further access and thereby reducing subsidies in agriculture and other areas which are actually quite distortive. So I think those are many clear areas where government can easily move forward without ruffling any feathers. Obviously, there are many big areas that also need reforms.
Bhuvana, what would be on your list if you had your top submissions to the government for consideration?
Tom, if we think about, sort of areas that affect people's lives, right? At least in terms of being able to convert this into income and therefore flourishing for your family, this would be land, labor, capital, right? The Indian government did a great deal over the last many, many years in liberalizing capital. That being said, they have not been able to liberalize, not just this government, but for the last many years, we've not been able to liberalize land and labor. So the freedom to build and the freedom to work, these are still nascent, in fact, in many ways, deeply constrained in India. So if I could have a submission with the government, I'd say this needs to be front and center on the agenda. And we need to be able to figure out formulae that you can persuade people to buy into, right? So you may not be able to move from the status quo to complete deregulation, because that is hard. There is political economy naughtiness around these issues. There is also the challenge of compensating the losers from reform. So these are complex, vexing issues. That being said, the union government in particular must use its convening power with states. India has nearly 30 states, some of which are the size of the United States, right? Uttar Pradesh, for example, 250, 260 million people. And so use your convening power to be able to work with states to help them with technical expertise, with building evidence, with convening all of those experts who are, sort of spread in other states, bringing best practices and ideas on negotiation, and then putting labor market regulation reform and putting land regulation reform front and center on the agenda. At least that would be my prayer to the incoming members of parliament.
Then, Amit, I was looking this morning at the Economic Freedom of the World report that Fraser Institute in Canada and its network of over 90 think tanks around the world, I think CCS among them, participates in. And what was interesting was, of course, you saw an increase in economic freedom, 1991, and the opening of the market, but pretty flat in recent years. And on regulatory burden of entering business, including getting a job and the freedom to enter into the labor market, India doesn't fare that well. It's 87th out of 165 countries. And what do you think could be done then to reduce the burden on people going out and getting work and producing wealth for their families?
Sure. Once again, thank you, Tom. One thing that has happened, if you see, the graph was not growing, but in between, you will also find a little bit of better ranking, a spike. And that came during the ease of doing business initiative that Government of India started. And we were also closely monitoring and submitting our ideas and recommendation. One thing that was liked and adopted and implemented by the Government of India under the ease of doing business campaign is when we started talking about removing the minimum capital requirement. So minimum capital requirement is one provision to set up a business. Any small or big business, you need to have some money fixed in a bank account, which lies idle in your bank account. You can't use it. It's supposed to be for emergency services. And for small businesses, it's a huge amount. That actually helped India to fare its ranking and rating. However, since then, not much has happened. And I think already Bhuvana has identified the land and labor. When land and labor related reforms are introduced, this will improve the ranking. And another major focus, if you look at the indicators where it ranks really bad, is contract enforcement. And that actually indicates the bad judiciary and legal system that we have. So another urgent reform that country requires is the judicial reforms. We have thousands and millions of cases pending, and finding justice and contract enforcement becomes too difficult. And as long as that situation is, no investor would like to invest money where there is a lot of uncertainty and not right, in some sense, protective, predictable environment. So judicial reforms. Yes, Parth.
No, I was just saying, building on both of them, that one reason why we don't see as much movement further in improving the economic freedom in India is also the bureaucracy. So I think now it's about time that we cannot make those fundamental changes unless we also change the administration and the governance of the country. And I think one of the key areas of reform required is how government governs itself, including, for example, we have 55, 60 different ministries, while most other countries have 10, 12, 15 ministries to govern, right? So I think there is a huge sort of load from the top, and therefore each of the ministry obviously has its own ways of governing and controlling the sectors they control, right? So unless I think we reform the governance itself, I think there is a less and less sort of confidence that we can make much of a progress in either land or labor or other areas where we need to see the progress.
And that's one of the things that you've been involved with in the Indian School of Public Policy also is helping people who are going to go into government service and so on to be able to administer things in a more rational fashion rather than just piling paperwork and paperwork and paperwork and forms and permits on struggling entrepreneurs. So that's really quite a remarkable initiative. I'd like to mention for everyone tuned in that you can pose questions for our guests through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And also mention for those of you who'd like to follow up on the work that these partners in India do, but also all around the world in 102 other countries to become a sponsor of Atlas Network. $25 opens the door and you get our magazine regularly, Freedom's Champion. Well, let me ask then, come back to the very first thing you said, Parth, about people viewing you returning to your homeland in India as somehow a foreign agent. You've done so much work with your colleagues and our friends around the country to revive the tradition of Indian free enterprise thinking as well, with IndianLiberals.org and republishing things from the Swatantra group, from all the brilliant intellectuals in India who advanced freedom. Tell us a little bit more about reviving the indigenous Indian tradition of liberty.
I think it's interesting and something I learned, of course, after coming back to India, as I read a little bit more in the Indian history, that from the ancient time, India always had a very divergent perspectives. So we cherish as much atheism as much as theism, right? So we have millions of gods, but if you did not believe in any of those gods, it was perfectly okay, right? So I think we had this diversity, but somehow I think over a period of time, we began to lose that. So I think in the modern time, obviously with the British and the British sort of enlightenment that came from Western part of the world, we see a tremendous progress in this area. So even during the early movement of freedom, there's a group of people within the Congress Party who were the liberal group, as well as we have socialist group, right? And within that group, there are quite a large number of people who had sort of seen why these ideas are fertile. So in my sort of reading of Indian history, I feel that there are three individuals who can actually, if you put them together, their thinking and their writing, you can create quite a unique sort of perspective on liberalism from Indian point of view. And I think one, of course, is Gandhiji for his own ideas of political freedom. Gandhi, as you know, was an anarchist. He did not believe in the state at all. And I think his ideas, and when it comes to politics, are really very powerful and quite actually revolutionary, even for modern our times. Then we had Rajaji, Rajgopalachari, who was the founder of the Swatantra Party, one of the only liberal party we had in India in the 1960s and 70s. His ideas of economic freedom are quite revolutionary in his times. And then we had Rabindranath Tagore, whose idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, meaning the world is my home, and therefore personal freedom that he championed, even sometime against Gandhi himself. And I think if you put together those three individuals and their thinking and writing, it could really create an Indian sort of version of classical liberal sort of philosophy, which I think will be very powerful addition to our thinking and the work that we do broadly in a global arena.
Well, and then such powerful contemporary intellectuals and writers as Gurcharan Das, for example, that path-breaking book, India Unbound, but then all of his later amazing books presenting ethical and moral and political foundations of a free, dynamic society, but embedded in the Indian context, drawing from the Vedic texts and so on. His books are available in English for all of our viewers, Gurcharan Das, D-A-S, and they're enlightening books. And I've learned so much from him and from others who have been associated with the freedom movement in India. Well, let me just ask a question then. Where do you see the classical liberal movement in India going forward? How is it going to advance? We've heard discussion of more hearts and minds, more reaching out and helping people to see things through a lens of dignity and respect for fellow Indians rather than the socialist mentality of we will control you, let people flourish. There are particular policy issues, liberalization of land market, making it easier to build, to house the population, and to gain employment. Start with you, Amit. Where do you see the future for India?
Well, I'm broadly an optimistic person. So I do see we may go up and down on liberty movement for a small while, but altogether it has to be expanding. And yeah, but one thing that I wanted to highlight, Tom, is if I may go back to your previous question,
Mm-hmm.
when you were talking about one key reform area that we would like to see, which is, well, related with this question too. I think if I have to pick just one area, I would pick school education. Why so? When you started this podcast, this conversation, you said India is the most populous country today, right? And we have been talking about the demographic dividend and India being youngest country, etc., etc. But we also know that one day it's going to come down, and the prediction is 2040 onwards, it will reach the peak and start coming down, which means after 2040, we would have more of a growing aging population and lesser number of younger kids, young population, which means we have this roughly 20 years of window to convert our young guys, our young human capital into high potential, high performing human capital. And those who would enter the labor market in, let's say, 2040, 42, 45, 47, these are the people who are entering the classroom grade 1 today. And therefore, I think the soonest there is urgency now to reform our education system so that we ensure that our young population, we are actually able to reap the benefit and take care of our future. And therefore, if our attempt, our focus should be on education reforms, and if we are able to do it, with the elections, hopefully there is a new government, same government, but that should be on the agenda no matter what government. And if we are able to do it, I see a brighter future for liberty movement. If not done well, um, we may also see challenges ahead.
How do you see it, Bhuvana?
Like Amit, I feel liberals are optimists just by the nature of our proclivities, if you will, right? Tom, the future is bright. The future is in India's states, and the future is in India's cities. And that's where I see the next phase of the liberty movement. And that's where we need to emphasize. I was thinking back to, sort of what is it that will shift the needle, both in terms of policy and in terms of broader buy-in for the kinds of ideas that we advocate. And I feel the subsidiarity principle really holds the answer, right? The closer that we are able to push these issues to the people, the better we will fare in getting context-appropriate responses. And that's where, in my mind, the future lies. So whether it is labor regulation, whether it is land regulation, whether it is school education, these are questions that states ought to be able to answer. And these are questions that cities or larger agglomerations, urban agglomerations should be able to answer. So my sense is that if we're going to take the liberty movement forward, we've done the first cut. We've now got a few state-specific think tanks. But I imagine now having city-specific groups, right, that are focused on Bombay Municipal Corporation, or Greater Bombay area, has about 25 odd million people. Delhi, Greater Delhi has about 20 odd million. Okay, Bombay, the numbers will go up and down. Somebody will say 18, somebody will say 25. That's a lot of people. It's small European countries, right? And so, to my mind, having those specific think tanks, having groups that are dealing with the policy challenges at that level is an idea waiting to happen, right? And so I feel like that's one place that I would see the future. The second place that I would see the future is in translating principle into practice. We have a lot of thinking that we've done at both the global level, the philosophy level, the 20,000-foot level. We need to cover the distance to be able to translate that into specific details and minutiae as they apply state after state, city after city, and then be able to solve those kinds of problems in a real way. And the third thing I would say is also building an engagement practice, not just teaching our sort of young people in the liberty movement to think about the issues, but also to be able to speak and engage with people and convert them in that one-to-one persuasion exercise on these issues. And so I feel like if we had to double down on our effort, this is where I would concentrate my energies.
I have a couple of questions have already come in. So one from Terry, who says, with the enormous growth of the information technology sector in India, which has helped so many millions of people, how does that connect with the opportunities for making education more available through school choice and broadening educational opportunities? Amit, you want to pick up on that?
Well, definitely, yes. So while providing education in schools is restricted and regulated, and therefore there is less innovation that you can actually do within your standardized system. EdTech, education technology is actually also giving you another option and opportunity to learn. So these days, actually, kids are not just learning from your textbook, from school, from what teachers are teaching, but now there are teachers and people and knowledge and resource material freely available, right? We have something like Khan Academy, which started. It's an online educational content put on YouTube for free. So if you have access to internet, access to a device, then you have education material available, right? So in that space, the edtech space actually started seeing the boom. I mean, there are many firms and startups have come up in edtech space who are doing incredible job. It has its own challenges, own hiccups, but over a period of time, it will get refined. So certainly, we are very positive about it.
I recall, and to try to communicate to our audience outside of India, how vast and amazing India is. In a way, it's a country, but it's also a world unto itself. When I had met someone from the Association of Fee-Paying Independent Schools or low-budget independent schools, and they said, "Well, we have 57,000 members." I thought, "Well, that's a big organization, 57,000 people." No, it was 57,000 schools. Uh, it was a mind-blowing change in my perspective. What would be a huge mass organization, many organizations, this was an organization of organizations. So this is just really enormous. And the numbers of children getting education through low budget, fee paying private schools is really staggering to see this. And this is an initiative that bubbled from the bottom up, it was not imposed from the top down. So Isaac asked a question about collaboration between government and private sector, for-profit firms, and civil society groups like CCS and other organizations, Prosperiti, and so on, to foster inclusive economic growth, namely that everybody gets to be involved, not just the elite or the cronies or those who already are at the top of the pyramid, but opportunities for everyone. And then what lessons are there for some other countries? People are tuning in from around the world. What lessons would you share about inclusive growth for them? So let me turn Bhuvana to you on this one.
Sure. I can give you an example from some of our work, and maybe that holds some inspiration or ideas for other countries. When we looked at labor regulation, which is the right of people to be able to work, to be able to put themselves to add value, and to be able to earn the best income. In India today, the law prevents women from working in the night shift. It prevents workers from working more than X hours a day. It puts a cap on, sort of how much you can earn, how much can be paid, the ways in which you can be hired, the ways in which you can be retrenched, and so on and so forth, right? So we sat with industry bodies as well as with government in different states to say what is feasible to do, what is the right thing to do first. But once we know that, within the climate, what is the feasible thing to do? And we sourced ideas in a series of these roundtables and consultations between industry and government, where industry was able to voice and say, look, these are our pain points. If I've got to be able to set up a semiconductor manufacturing facility in your state, I am unable to do it because of reasons A, B, and C. The government was able to point out, or the department was able to share what its challenges were. If there is an adverse incident concerning labor, we are in the crosshairs in terms of, sort of public protest and public shaming. We've got to be able to insulate against some of those. Then there is the political voices, which have their own compulsions. And to bring people in, one of our former colleagues, in fact, initiated this workshop in Uttar Pradesh, where we were able to do this multi-party conversation. And what it did was three things. First is that making pain points of entrepreneurs and workers salient to the establishment. The second is doing it the other way around. And third is to be able to come up with a practical, implementable agenda for change. So we commit to making these 8 reforms happen over the next year. We'll pick up the next set of more difficult reforms once we've seen success on these 8. So getting out of it with an agenda and a playbook, that added a tremendous amount of value. We're trying to replicate this in the space of land use or building regulation as well, where the laws tell you how much you can build on a particular plot of land. And we're trying to help different governments troubleshoot on very, very practical problems around this by connecting industry voice with government voice and being the person in between who can then do the drafting support that is necessary to be able to execute, right? So maybe these are ideas that hold some opportunities for folks in other countries trying out policy reforms as well.
I'd like to, we have one last question, but before turning to that, Parth, tell us a little bit about the tremendous work that your colleagues have done in interacting with the media, radio, television, and print, and internet, and so on, to communicate in everyday language that most of us can understand, rather than just the academic terms in which these are often phrased.
I think at CCS, I think as you highlighted earlier, we have this accumulation of Indian liberal writing in one single place called indianliberals.org. So I think that's a great place for people. And there are many stories coming out of that. There are quite a few people writing their dissertation and master thesis on the content which is there. I think it's a great access, in a sense, access to people who want to look deeper into how the Indian thought around these ideas have evolved. Secondly, I think we also have at CCS, Amit can speak more about this, azadi.me, which is the portal which sort of takes some of these ideas, many of the documentaries, other things that we have done in local language, in Hindi, which is actually spoken by many more people than English is spoken around the world in a way. And therefore, I think it's a great platform through which these ideas are getting translated into one of the most powerful local language, and which is the language of the current government. So I think it's important to continue that work and make sure that translation work and the original writing happens in those languages.
We're coming toward the end. I've got one more question I can squeeze in here from Debbie. How much of an issue is corruption in India these days? You don't hear much about it as much as you used to. Has it diminished, or is it just less covert? Who would like to pick up that sensitive issue?
So it has. Okay. And it has
go ahead.
Yeah, you can add to that. I think it has substantially gone down. I mean, I came to India in 1997. Even to get a telephone connection, you had to bribe people. So I think from those days, I think technology obviously had to play an important role in reducing corruption. And I think also at the same time, the corruption, of course, is there, as everybody knows, but it's also more centralized. And the petty corruption that citizens had to face on a day-to-day basis, I think that has gone down substantially. So I think in that sense, for average citizen, there's a huge change. Obviously, at the higher levels of business, there is still the same and maybe even higher amount of corruption that goes on. Bhuvana, you.
No, Parth is, I think, right. All the areas where we liberalized the availability of consumer goods, the availability of or the access to things, all of those areas, there is a dramatic reduction of corruption. Take, for example, something as simple as consumer transport or public transport, right? Until about a decade ago, you didn't have as much private public transport, sort of feeder connecting transport. Cabs, for instance, were just not there. It was deeply, tightly controlled. But once you started to open the market, meaning that the corruption there would be in acquiring an auto rickshaw, getting the medallion for it, being able to then ply on the streets. There was a quota that restricted it. But that, sort of has diminished simply because you have Meru cabs, and then you had it followed by Uber cabs, and it changed the face of many of these things. So in obvious places, there is a dramatic reduction of corruption. The second is that the government since 2014, has taken a very large number of undertaken process reforms, right? Things around paperwork movement, applications, licenses, registers, and so on and so forth. And that then means that the facilitation fee, particularly around running an enterprise, have gone down, and everyday pains around those have gone down. Where it remains really high and where it is centralized is around the things that we have yet to liberalize. Land, for instance, the buying and selling of land in India is still the changing of property title, even the establishment of property title. It continues to be a deeply corrupt area, whether it is small, whether it is large, right? The buying and transportation across state borders, that's an area where there is still a fair bit of trouble. We still have a lot of import controls and a whole bunch of trade restrictions. Philip Thompson and Lorenzo Montanari write about the trade barrier index, right? And India comes up fairly poorly on it, which means that customs-related corruption is really high. And so there are pockets of this where we've not done as well as we ought to have. And these are also opportunity areas for us to fix. But everyday corruption in many of these things has gone down dramatically.
That's very exciting news. And I'd like to conclude with a very important announcement. And that is someone whom I've admired and learned from for so many years. Parth Shah is being recognized for his transformative impact on India, on securing more liberty, more lawfulness, more open government, more prosperity, more progress, hope, and opportunity for over 1 billion people in India. So Dr. Parth Shah will be recognized with the Sir Anthony Fisher Achievement Award at this year's Freedom Dinner and the Liberty Forum, which will be in New York. There's a link that's available for everyone. There's early bird registration, so you can register at the lower price to show up and join us in honoring Parth. But through Parth, also all of his colleagues who have contributed so much to bring freedom to such an important and significant nation, over 1.3 billion people, all of whom are enjoying more liberty and more prosperity. Thanks to Parth, to our colleagues, Andrea, Bhuvana, and so many others. It's an honor to be with you here today. And I hope to see many of you in New York at the Freedom Dinner and the Liberty Forum. And finally, don't forget, you can become a sponsor of Atlas Network. Just $25 opens the door to a world of liberty. So please come through the door and join us. With that, I'll say goodbye to all. Thanks so much for your attention, and be free.
If you enjoyed this edition of Freedom Worldwide, please help us support this program and our partners by making a tax-deductible donation to Atlas Network. And with your gift of $25 or more, we'll deliver a printed subscription to our Freedom's Champion magazine, full of exclusive stories about the amazing people of the worldwide freedom movement. Just click the link to get your subscription today.